Hi, I am Alexandra Dane. I'm a lecturer in media and communications at the University of Melbourne. I'm really happy to be talking to you today. I wrote a book called Gender and Prestige in Literature, Contemporary Australian Book Publishing, and it's a 50-year study of the relationship between gender and systems of prestige building in the Australian publishing sector, looking at book reviews, literary festivals and literary prizes, and counting the number of men and women who are sort of represented in those spaces from 1965 to 2015. So a huge quantitative data set. There's also some qualitative methods involved as well in this study, but that's not what we're talking about today. And I learned a lot about quantitative data and counting in book culture, and some thoughts about that I'd kind of like to share with you today. So inspired by the Vita count, the Stellar count, and research by scholars such as Beth Driscoll and Lisbeth Van Zunen, I started an ambitious project to understand the relationship between gender and literary prestige in the Australian publishing sector across half a century. In 2015, it seemed really important to me that we, the industry, scholars of the industry, had a comprehensive longitudinal quantitative data set that demonstrated the continued existence of a gender gap within Australia's consecratory institutions. Perhaps it is still important. However, I learned a lot about quantitative data and its role in understanding equality over the process of conducting this research. Naturally, what I have learned about counting when researching contemporary book culture has raised more questions than it's answered. And I have this data set with hundreds of thousands of individual points that answer questions that we already knew the answer to. The structured hierarchy of our literary field supports the continued dominance of white male authors. Why then did I and many others feel the need to get counting? In feminist media studies, Lisbeth Van Zunen argues that quantitative methods have long been used by feminist scholars in order to provide evidence of inequality that is perhaps anecdotally understood. This idea was foundational to my study. Everybody knew that women were disadvantaged in the publishing industry. Perhaps if we could just show the powerful people the numbers and the statistics, they would be inspired to make a change. This is also the foundational idea that underpins the Vita and the Stellar counts and a lot of the feminist book sector research of the 1980s. However, as my journey through the research process developed, and I spoke to research colleagues doing similar studies in different national contexts, the question of who this data is for continued to rise. Richard Jean So's Redlining Culture presents evidence for the racial inequalities in the post-war American literary field. This study also takes a longitudinal approach to articulating, evidencing, the stark underrepresentation of Black authors and authors of colour in book reviews, prizes, and bestseller lists. And Jean So's study confirms that the contemporary literary field and those who work to support its structures operate with a racist rationale. One of the things that I discuss in my research and the things that I use quantitative data to support is the fact that a whole-scale cultural change is required in order to bring about field-wide equality, the kind of equality that is so desperately needed and so desperately absent in our contemporary context. The sexism and racism that is embedded in the literary field's consecratory institutions don't exist in isolation, though. And there's systems of perception and thought that are socialized from a really early age and are supported by things like the school system. This causes me to reflect on my role and the role of my research in transforming the literary field and the potentially problematic consequences of counting to evidence inequality. Scholarly and non-scholarly justifications for counting as a research method often cite the role of concrete evidence as a reason why this is an effective methodological approach. This justification is understandable because if I say that women don't have equal access to the systems of reputation building in the Australian publishing sector and show you the numbers to support this claim, you're likely to agree with me. The field is unlikely to change, but you're likely to agree with me. However, without the support of this data that was extremely time-consuming to collect and analyse, the fact remains that the literary field is inherently unequal, and women authors, editors, critics, and publishers have been saying this for decades and decades. Why don't we believe them? Why are the numbers doing that? What are the numbers doing that the experiences of women in the publishing industry can't? And more importantly, what does it mean that I play into the assumption that women's experiences are not evidenced enough by counting the number of women reviewers who wrote in The Australian from 1965 to 2015? Does the fact that Richard Jean So has written a brilliant and deeply researched book that illustrates and evidences the racism of the post-war American literary field really surprise anyone who's paying attention? Who are we counting for? The other problematic factor to consider in this kind of research is when you're counting descriptive demographic data in order to determine or illustrate inequality, what are the ways in which this activity of counting can establish boundaries and categories and therefore visibilities and invisibilities just by virtue of the counting? In considering the method of counting individuals, Christina Neuvert interrogates the boundaries and the binaries that we establish when we start to count groups of people and the effects of these binaries. Neuvert is studying the relationship between gender and systems of prestige building in the Scottish literary field, and in doing so has uncovered their discomfort with the notion of counting genders. Neuvert is counting women, men, and non-binary authors who are published by Scottish publishers, appear at Scottish book festivals, and win Scottish book prizes. However, even in counting women, men, and non-binary authors, Neuvert is establishing a binary or rigidity or rigidly categorized definition of gender, the non-binary, binary gender binary, which, like the gender binary itself, is a categorization approach that does not sufficiently describe gender disparity in the field and can have problematic knock-on effects. We are placing individuals in categories that are limited in their ability to be descriptive and significantly challenge notions of intersectionality. Notions of the problematic nature of binaries, categorization, and counting and building data set is also requires questioning when we're discussing race. How do we determine someone's race? How do we categorize disadvantage or inequality? And how do we work to decenter whiteness? These are all questions and challenges faced by the quantitative researcher. Despite all these reservations, I don't think that counting and quantitative methods are inherently bad. And I do think they hold a really important place in the study of contemporary book culture. Stats are great. Data sets are great. But I do think it's important that we acknowledge and interrogate the fact that these numbers and categories and the research that comes from numbers and categories is not without its problems. And numbers are never apolitical. So that's kind of it from me. I think I'm going to be discussing this a bit further with you on Thursday, and I really look forward to meeting you all. Thank you.